The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 3, A Book Out of Nowhere and an Interview in a Mental Institution. You can imagine my feelings 3 days later when I learned that Ram had been admitted to a psychiatric clinic under his own cognizance and labeled a schizophrenic. In the oddest way, this relieved my mind. I wouldn't have to regard what he'd said to me that night with any seriousness. And while I felt sorry for him, I also felt absolutely free. Yes, I looked back at our meeting and remembered his strange excitement. I wondered, did our interview and my own bizarre experiences set him off? Even so, he must have been predisposed towards that particular illness for some time, I thought. Yet it seemed that I should have been alert enough to spot the symptoms. So, somewhat guiltily, I decided to visit him as soon as possible. It was nearly a week before the opportunity presented itself. For one thing, my academic load was considerable then, and despite my resolution, I kept putting the visit off. All kinds of excuses came into mind until I took myself in hand and realized that I felt illogically responsible for Ram's condition. I was reacting quite mechanically, feeling guilt for no reason, as I'd been programmed to do by my background both as a private person and as a member of our society. So the next very day I made my duty call and met Ram's new friend for the first time, Queen Alice, as she's called. A kooky old lady about Ram's age who's taken him in hand, or he's taken her in hand. But the interview was most unsettling and particular. I say this because it almost seemed as if Ram was checking on my state of mind instead of the other way around. "Dr. Braille," I said, striding, I hoped, with a strong, positive, reassuring step into the common room. "Ah, Geoffrey boy, step into my parlor," he said, with the sweetest of guileless smiles. Other patients made way. Ram was playing the role of kindly old psychologist, this time to perfection, and the other patients surrounded him like supporting actors, showing him difference, while Ram kept smiling like some ancient Pied Piper. He indicated in one corner of the room where an old table stood, a beat-up conference table about which chairs were cocked at crazy angles. Then he smiled again and sat down as if I were a patient of whom he was particularly fond. His whole manner indicated that this was his office or its equivalent. He wore his own clothes rather than any hospital-like garb. He treated the table as if it were his desk, ignoring the piles of torn magazines which he shoved aside. I was taken aback, yet willing enough to go along with the pretense, considering Ram's condition, when he gestured to a woman who came up beside us and said, "Dear Queen Alice, do sit down with us. You'll be interested in Geoffrey boy here." As Ram spoke, the other patients began to mill about, make noises, cough, sneeze, or in other ways seem to indicate that they were involved in their own concerns and wouldn't eavesdrop. At the same time, their motions also seemed sly and aimless. I had no idea how to react to them, being more used to dealing with laboratory rats than people. I pulled myself together, smiled jovially, and said, "Well, now, how are we feeling?" "Fine, fine," Ramrad answered, with no indication of anything at all was wrong. "I'm continuing our research at this end, and Queen Alice here has become my assistant." "I'm very glad to meet you," I replied nervously, and I had to turn to look at the woman as Ramram's attitude so clearly demanded. I didn't want to ruffle him, but I didn't particularly want to deal with anyone else either. Queen Alice's white hair made a wiry brush about her face. She was wearing dungarees and a shirt, and for some reason her attire upset my sense of prosperity, an attitude that even then I understood was unfair and ridiculous. "Queen Alice?" I said gently, with a hint of a smile, I suppose. "Another nickname of sorts, or rather a title of difference," Ramram said. "It really denotes the fact that she's out of her time. She's living in the wrong century." "A dreadful inconvenience," Queen Alice added. "And so few understand. Oh, some do. I'm not saying that. But no, I'm not a queen. I've no pretensions of earthly royalty. I presume you're a gentleman of your century." "Oh yes, he is that indeed," Ramram said with obvious relish and an almost sarcastic chuckle. And the entire affair was just too much for me. I was about to make some excuse and leave when Ramram leaned forward with sudden, almost gay attitude of conspiracy and said quickly, "We haven't all the time in the world, you know. So I want to fill you in on what I've learned so far." Tolerantly enough, I put off my departure and said, "Go ahead," for I hoped that I could learn just how irrational he actually was. And certainly my curiosity was more than aroused. This is my first encounter with schizophrenia in a human. We've induced similar symptoms in rats through the use of disorientation conditioning, but this was something else. So while I tried to look sympathetic and personally involved, I kept track of Ramram's reactions at the same time. He acted feverish as he started speaking, gesticulating quickly, urgently, his small brown eyes not leaving my face for what seemed like an eternity. He wouldn't let me look away, and kept punctuating his sentences with excited exclamations. "You see? You see?" So I was forced to say, "Yes, yes," and sit there while he stared at me with the greatest intentness. A most uncomfortable spot to be put in, I might add, and a very curious situation indeed. "These people here, in their way, are quite sane," he said, "a fact that I've often suspected about such patients. They are not, I repeat, not insane. You see?" "Yes, of course," I answered, not wanting to upset him further. "But beyond that, listen. This is important. Queen Alice hears voices. They speak to her at various times, delivering what seems to be the most astonishing information. Once I heard them, too, though not as clearly as she does, and am not really certain that they were the same voices. I believe this information to be a kind of garbled divine dialogue. Do you follow me? His eyes still hadn't left my face. I tried to hide my almost overwhelming dejection that a fine mind could deteriorate so in such a brief time. Lacking practical experience or not, I knew enough to recognize the classic symptoms of his disease. You see, he said impatiently, his normal clothes and appearance contrasted so sharply with the wildness of his manner that I was ready to leap from my chair in consternation when he reached out and grabbed my arm forcibly. "Have you begun your out-of-body experiments yet?" he asked in a hoarse whisper. "No." "Well, you must. At once. It's vital. This time," he shouted. "Yes, I will tonight," I said so soothingly as possible, but having no intention, of course, of doing any such thing. "He doesn't believe in my voices at all," Queen Alice said suddenly. I spun around to look at her, having forgotten her presence entirely. She stood up, frowning, stared at me with the uncompromising clarity that children and the mad both sometimes assume. I didn't know what to do or say. Certainly I didn't want to upset either of them. Just then, a tall, clownish-looking man came up to us. He walked bent over, but quickly, on the balls of his feet. He took a magazine from the table and wrinkled it at me sympathetically. "Don't let it bother you none," he said, and winked at me. "Oh, yeah. None of us hear the voices either like Queen Alice does. Maybe you'll be able to hear them later on yourself. You never can tell." He winked encouragingly and went back to his chair. I just stared after him. This patient wanted me to understand that I was in the same boat as all of them. He was trying to comfort me. I rose to leave. As I did, again the other patients began to mill about. Queen Alice squared her squatty shoulders and asked suddenly, "Who do you think you are? I mean, who do you imagine yourself to be?" "Nobody," I said. "That's too bad," she answered, with the craziest smile. Ram said, "That's his trouble." Without another word, I left. Actually, I was more shaken than I wanted to admit. Obviously, the conversation in my apartment had sent Ram off, I thought. For now he supposed that we were conducting some esoteric experiment together in which Queen Alice's voices were also involved. I shook my head. That poor old coot. Yet, as I returned home, I could feel my mood swing about in the most unusual fashion from definite disquiet to an almost lethargic passivity. From this latter I was then struck by a sudden exuberance in which it seemed that everything would work out well, and, indeed, that none of my problems or Ram's were important at all. I'd been working too hard, I thought. Obviously the experiences that led me to call Ram were perfectly natural results of exhaustion. I decided to take some vitamin C. Then my exhilaration quickened. The idea came to me that there was something I must write down at once. Almost without thinking, I inserted some paper into my old typewriter. I recall being surprised beyond measure at the first sight of what I'd written, for there at the top of the page where the following words appeared as if a title: The Further Education of OverSoul 7. I stared. The further education of what? What had possessed me to write such a nonsense phrase? Yet even as I puzzled over the sentence, excitement seized me. Suddenly assured and full of confidence, I began typing as fast as my hands would go. The words seemed to slip through my brain from someplace else and onto the paper, yet I had no idea where the material was coming from. Moreover, a story of sorts seemed to be developing. I was aware of the words, perhaps, a second before my fingers actually typed them, and to my amazement, the pace actually quickened. I didn't even have time to read what was on one sheet of paper before, urgently, the next sentence appeared. 2 hours passed. Finally I stopped, dazed, lit a cigarette, and almost immediately felt again that strong compulsion to type. Was it a compulsion? It was certainly far more than an impulse, yet I was sure that I could resist it if I chose. Instead, I decided on the spot to go along as an experiment of sorts and see what would happen. What happened was the beginning of a book with a rather improbable title given earlier. Except for a short break, I typed steadily for 4 hours. I had no idea of the quality of the material, but its imaginative fantasy struck me as highly uncharacteristic of my own personality. Outside of dry academic papers, I've never done any writing in my adult life. The rest of the evening I spent trying to trace my own subjective states before and during the experience. This time I didn't make the mistake of calling anyone, but I was more frightened than I'd been earlier. Now I was faced with the physical evidence before me, a stack of writing produced by me in a way that I could not understand. Where had it come from? Would I be seized by the same compulsion again? And could I really resist if I wanted to? Or was I only fooling myself? Even those questions became unimportant as another, more terrifying thought came to me. If Ram was considered mad because he sometimes heard voices, where does this put me? Was it possible that schizophrenia was actually caused by some as yet undiscovered virus and had been passed on by Ram to me? Impossible, I thought. Yet such an explanation would at least place the entire affair within the realm of the real and reasonable. I knew it was silly, but I took another vitamin C, remembering that large doses were supposed to combat infections. I also comforted myself that no auditory or visual hallucinations had been involved. As it happened, the episode was followed by another, and still another. I am recording these odd chapters here, with no changes. As you read on, you'll see the strange way in which OverSoul 7 began to take over the ordinary details of my life. End chapter 3. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.